To the world, theirs had once looked like the kind of romance history preserves in lacquer and gold. A beautiful young queen, a monarch on a throne, a marriage staged beneath chandeliers and state ritual, as if splendor itself could guarantee permanence. By 1958, that illusion had already broken. The queen had been cast out, the marriage dismantled, the fairy tale reduced to diplomatic language and public silence. But the true ending of their story did not arrive with the divorce. It came much later, in exile, in illness, and in the cruel private space where power can no longer protect the people who once lived inside it. Years after they were separated, the Shah of Iran was dying, his body failing, his empire gone, the grand machinery of royalty stripped down to pain, memory, and regret. It was then that Soraya wrote to him, not as a queen, not as a symbol, but as the woman who had once loved him, and who, beneath the wreckage of scandal, duty, humiliation, and loss, had apparently never stopped. What followed belongs less to the language of court history than to tragedy. Not the polished tragedy nations prefer, with flags at half-mast and careful speeches, but the more intimate and merciless kind. Two people bound by love, separated by dynasty, and denied even the dignity of a final farewell. In public, they had been dressed as royalty. In private, they were subject to the same brutal laws that govern ordinary grief, timing, illness, pride, betrayal, and death. This is the part history rarely lingers on, not the pageantry, not the jewels, but the human cost waiting behind them, the loneliness hidden inside palaces, the violence of expectation, and the quiet ruin left by love when power decides it has other plans for their lives. Soraya Esfandiari was born into the kind of privilege that, from a distance, looks almost interchangeable with safety. She was the only daughter of Khalil Esfandiari, an Iranian aristocrat, and Ava Karl, his German wife, and her early life moved between cultivated worlds, Europe and Persia, elegance and ceremony, cosmopolitan polish and inherited rank. She grew up amid fine fabrics, formal rooms, and the quiet assurance that certain doors would open for her before she ever had to knock. In photographs from that period, she seems to belong perfectly to that universe, composed, luminous, exquisitely dressed. But old systems of power have always known how to turn beauty into currency, and how to mistake a young girl's poise for consent. By the late 1940s, the Pahlavi court was looking for what courts like that always claim to be looking for, when they are, in fact, searching for something much narrower. Not a partner, but a solution. Mohammad Reza Shah needed a wife who could satisfy the demands of dynasty, appearance, and bloodline. The monarchy wanted grace without threat, glamour without independence, youth without resistance. Somewhere inside that calculation, a photograph of Soraya found its way into royal hands. That was all it took. A single image. A face, carefully framed. A girl, barely out of childhood, reduced in an instant to possibility. To the Queen Mother, Soraya appeared to possess the qualities the court prized most: beauty, breeding, poise, and that dangerous attribute mistaken for destiny whenever powerful families want history to seem inevitable. She looked, in other words, like someone who could be placed inside the machinery of monarchy and made to serve it. She was only 16. There is something chilling, in retrospect, about how quickly such decisions can harden around a young woman's life. In royal narratives, these moments are usually draped in romance. They are retold as if fate itself had intervened, as if a photograph had revealed not a suitable candidate, but a chosen one. But monarchies are rarely as mystical as they sound in memoirs. They are administrative. They assess. They inspect. They send emissaries. Before Soraya was brought anywhere near the throne, she had to be looked at more closely. So the Queen Mother dispatched one of her daughters to see the girl for herself. The errand was dressed up in the language of family curiosity, but its meaning was more severe. Soraya was being evaluated. Her face, her manner, her bearing, Perhaps even the way she entered a room or held a teacup, everything would have been read for signs, not signs of happiness, signs of suitability. What kind of bride would she make? What kind of queen could she be shaped into? Could she flatter the dynasty? Could she survive it? These are not always the same question, though royal families have a habit of pretending they are. The princess returned with approval. Soraya, she reported, was exactly right. And with that, the process moved forward. Soon the teenager was invited to the royal palace in Tehran. Officially, it was simply a visit. That is how power often introduces itself when it does not want to alarm its target. A meeting, an invitation, a family occasion. Nothing on the surface that would sound coercive. Nothing that would force anyone to name what was really happening. But beneath the polished language, the truth was unmistakable. This was not a social call. This was an audition for one of the most gilded and unforgiving roles in the modern Middle East. The tragedy, of course, is that girls of 16 are often old enough to understand glamour, but not yet old enough to measure the full cost of entering it. When Soraya arrived at court, the palace offered exactly what such places are built to offer: spectacle before truth. Uniforms, marble, protocol, male authority arranged as theatre. The Shah, still young enough to appear romantic and powerful at once, stood at the center of it all in military dress, crisp, controlled, unmistakably regal. For a girl raised amid refinement but not yet consumed by political ritual, the effect must have been overwhelming. He did not simply look like a man. He looked like the state, translated into elegance. She was captivated almost at once. Later, she would remember him in terms that suggest not calculation but enchantment. He seemed magnificent to her. That word matters, because it belongs as much to stagecraft as to love. Magnificence is what institutions produce when they want to be admired before they are understood. It is the glow that power casts over itself. It can feel irresistible, especially to someone young enough to mistake grandeur for goodness. And he, by all accounts, was taken with her just as quickly. The speed of what followed tells its own story. By the next day, Soraya's father, who had accompanied her, was informed that the Shah and his family were pleased. More than pleased. The decision, it seemed, had already ripened into certainty. She was suitable. She was desirable. She was, from the perspective of the court, exactly what was needed. The Shah was prepared to move at once. That haste is often described as evidence of passion. Maybe some of it was. But royal urgency is never innocent. A dynasty does not move quickly because it is sentimental. It moves quickly because it fears delay. Delay invites doubt. Doubt invites escape. And somewhere beneath the flattering language of admiration and approval was the harder truth that Soraya's future was being arranged by people for whom her youth made her more, not less, convenient. Her father delivered the news in the simplest possible form. Would she marry him? It sounds, in retrospect, like a question that should have opened into many others. Did she understand what it meant to enter that family? Did she know the loneliness built into ceremonial life? Did anyone explain that palaces are often factories of silence, where a woman may be adored publicly and managed privately? Did anyone tell her that queens are rarely chosen for themselves, but for the function they are expected to perform once the jewels are on? No one asked those questions. Or if they did, history did not keep them. What remains is the answer. Soraya said yes. And just like that, the beautiful daughter of an aristocratic household stepped across the threshold that separates privilege from sacrifice. What looked from the outside like assent was, in truth, the beginning of a bargain she was far too young to understand. That in royal life, adoration is often conditional, selection is mistaken for honor, and the moment a girl is treated like destiny, she may already be losing ownership of her own fate. From the beginning, the marriage carried the kind of warning signs that royal histories tend to soften into atmosphere, as if unease were merely part of the pageantry. But nothing about Soraya's situation was abstract. She was very young, and the man she was being asked to marry was not. Mohammad Reza was already a fully formed monarch in his 30s, a man shaped by court life, political expectation, and the private distortions of a dynasty that had long confused authority with emotional damage. The age gap mattered not simply because of the years between them, but because of what those years contained: experience, power, precedent, and the quiet advantage of a man entering marriage as the state itself, while the girl beside him was still being asked to become someone. And then there was the family. Every monarchy markets itself as continuity, stability, bloodline, tradition. What it rarely advertises is the psychic wreckage that often sits inside the house. The Pahlavi household was no exception. By the time Soraya entered its orbit, the dynasty already carried the emotional glamour of coercion. Fathers who believed hardness could manufacture strength. Mothers who converted anxiety into control. Sons raised under a regime of discipline so cold it passed for grooming. Mohammad Reza's father had reportedly treated him with a brutality meant to harden him into manhood, as though affection were a form of weakness and fear a legitimate educational tool. The Queen Mother, for her part, brought a different kind of violence, less visible, more suffocating. Possessive, intrusive, and fiercely territorial, she did not merely oversee the family, she policed its emotional borders. This was the world into which Soraya was stepping, and it should have frightened the adults around her more than it did. There was also the matter of precedent, which in royal life is often another name for warning. The Shah had already been married once before, and that first marriage had not failed quietly. His former wife, Princess Fawzia of Egypt, had entered Iran under circumstances not unlike Soraya's: beautiful, exalted, useful to the dynasty. She too had been absorbed into the theatrical splendor of court life. She too had learned that elegance offers no immunity from isolation. By most accounts, the union had been deeply unhappy, and the Shah had not distinguished himself within it. His infidelity was no secret. The collapse of that marriage did not stand in the past as a closed chapter, it stood there as evidence. A pattern had already announced itself, and still the machinery moved forward. By then, however, momentum had become its own form of pressure. Soraya had said yes, and royal engagements do not leave much room for ordinary hesitation. Once a young woman has been selected, named, dressed, and imagined in public, retreat becomes harder than consent. Plans were made. The wedding was scheduled for late December 1950. Everything was arranged in the language monarchies prefer: certainty, ceremony, inevitability. But then, almost as if the body itself were resisting what history had decided, Soraya fell gravely ill on the eve of the ceremony. Typhoid. It is tempting in retrospect to call it an omen, though that word can sound too lyrical for what it really was: a young woman physically collapsing under the approach of an event the world insisted on treating as triumph. The wedding had to be postponed. For a brief moment, reality interrupted spectacle. Fever overruled protocol. Flesh did what titles could not control. And yet even that pause did not produce reflection so much as impatience. The palace did not seem to interpret her illness as a reason to reconsider the timing, the pressure, or the fragility of the bride at the center of all this. It treated the delay as an inconvenience to be managed. The romantic version of this period is easy to tell, and therefore easy to distrust. The devoted groom, the bedside visits, the jewels left like tender offerings beside an ailing girl. Perhaps some of it was sincere. Perhaps he loved her in the way a powerful man can love someone he is not yet required to understand. But romance inside a court is never just romance. It is also choreography. A jewel on a pillow is beautiful. It is not, however, a substitute for time, safety, or restraint. What Soraya needed was recovery. What the dynasty wanted was completion. So a new date was fixed with astonishing speed. Barely 6 weeks later, on February 12, 1951, the marriage would go ahead. That decision tells you nearly everything. Not about love, but about priority. A healthy young bride was apparently less urgent than a finished ceremony. A body still recovering from serious illness could be dressed, supported, and carried through the rite if necessary. The institution had invested too much to wait. Royal life has always been able to disguise haste as destiny, pressure as devotion, and structural indifference as mere tradition. Soraya would bear the cost of that conversion in her own body. When the day arrived, she was not truly well. She was upright, which is not the same thing. On the morning of her wedding, she was so depleted she could barely stand. She shook from weakness and cold, still diminished by illness, not yet restored to herself. And then, as if the scene required one final emblem of everything monarchy asks women to perform, she was placed inside a dress so magnificent it bordered on cruelty. Christian Dior designed the gown that would make history. It was lavish, feathered, luminous with embellishment, the kind of dress that survives in photographs long after the body inside it has been forgotten. People remember its grandeur because grandeur is what official memory prefers. What official memory tends to neglect is weight. The gown weighed around 66 pounds. It was an object of extraordinary beauty and extraordinary burden, and on a strong woman it would have been formidable. On a teenager still recovering from typhoid, it was nearly punishing. That is the image worth lingering on. Not the fantasy, but the imbalance. A weakened girl under an imperial garment, expected to move gracefully while her body was failing her. The dress has often been celebrated as one of the most glamorous in royal history. It may also deserve to be remembered as one of the most revealing. It showed, almost too perfectly, what dynastic spectacle does to female suffering. It trims it, beads it, photographs it, and calls it elegance. Soraya was so cold that she reportedly had to hide practical layers beneath the couture. Heavy socks, extra warmth, little secret defenses against the trembling no amount of ceremony could entirely conceal. There is something devastating in that detail. Beneath the public fiction of splendor was a shivering girl, trying not to collapse. Beneath the feathers and pearls was not triumph, but endurance. At the last moment, even the Shah could see that the performance was becoming physically impossible. Just before the ceremony, he cut down the train of the dress so that Soraya could manage the walk before her. This gesture is often told as intimate, protective, almost romantic, and perhaps it was in part. But it was also an emergency adjustment to a spectacle that had already gone too far. The bride was struggling under the literal weight of what had been placed on her, and the solution was not to stop the ceremony. It was to make the burden slightly easier to drag. That, in miniature, is the tragedy of so many royal marriages. The warning signs are not hidden. They are visible from the beginning. In the age imbalance, in the damaged family, in the institutional haste, in the precedent of earlier harm, in the way a sick girl is still expected to smile beneath diamonds. But power has a genius for rebranding distress as devotion. It can look at a trembling bride and see not a person in danger, but a beautiful scene finally ready to begin. And so Soraya went forward, not because the path was safe, but because by then the entire court had already decided that she must. After the wedding, one truth revealed itself almost immediately. This was not a cold political arrangement disguised as romance. They were genuinely, dangerously attached to one another. That is part of what makes the story so cruel. Had there been no love, the marriage might have settled into the ordinary numbness of dynastic life. But affection was there from the start. Intense, possessive, volatile, and therefore poorly suited to a court that demanded discipline above all things. Soraya did not enter the marriage as a composed constitutional consort. She entered it as an 18-year-old girl placed inside one of the most ceremonial, male-controlled, and emotionally surveilled institutions in the world. She was adored, displayed, and envied, but she was not yet formed. And a palace is a terrible place in which to grow up. because it punishes immaturity while manufacturing it in everyone around you. In her brighter moods, Soraya could be irresistible. She had beauty, wit, and that elusive social electricity which makes a room reorganize itself around one person without quite admitting it has done so. She could be warm, playful, affectionate, even disarmingly charming. These were not invented qualities. They were part of what made the Shah love her with such visible devotion. But youth, especially youth trapped under pressure, can turn quickly. Her anger seems to have arrived with the same force as her charm, sharp, theatrical, and impossible to ignore. At one public dinner, after a quarrel with her husband, she reportedly seized an expensive vase and hurled it against a wall, shattering not just porcelain, but the carefully managed illusion of royal composure. Guests who had come to admire elegance found themselves staring at something far more revealing. A teenage queen unraveling in full view of the people trained never to look directly at private distress. Her temper was not merely dramatic, it could be exquisitely punishing. She knew where to wound, and she knew that in a court built on male deference, humiliation could be a form of counterpower. After one especially bitter rupture, she barred the Shah from her room for an extended period, leaving him to sleep outside like a dismissed petitioner rather than a husband or sovereign. The image is almost absurd until you remember what it exposes. Beneath the jeweled titles and choreographed bows, this was a marriage of grievance, pride, and emotional warfare. When someone in the household gently suggested that perhaps His Majesty should be allowed back inside, Soraya is said to have responded with chilly contempt, indicating a corner as though he were any other inconvenient piece of furniture. It was funny, perhaps, to some. It was also bleak. The palace that presented itself to the world as the summit of order was, in private, becoming a theatre of resentment. Still, it would be too simple and too convenient for the institution to reduce Soraya to the stereotype of the spoiled young queen. The truth is more uncomfortable. She was badly matched not only to the man she married, but to the role she was expected to perform. Her beauty made her an icon almost overnight. She photographed brilliantly. She wore glamour as if born to it. But looking like a queen and consenting to the life of one are not remotely the same thing. Soraya loved the Shah, but she did not love court ritual, ceremonial stiffness, or the endless choreography of symbolic duty. She disliked the costumes of obedience almost as much as the obedience itself. Formal wardrobes bored her. Official appearances exhausted her. The more tedious obligations of monarchy, the smiling, the receiving lines, the cultural posture, the endless patience demanded of royal women, seemed to have struck her not as honor, but as confinement. The court noticed quickly, and courts are built to punish non-compliance long before they acknowledge suffering. Soraya was already vulnerable in their eyes. She was not fully theirs. Her European mother, her continental Polish, the cosmopolitan texture of her upbringing, all of it made sections of the Iranian elite suspicious of her before she had done anything at all. She entered palace life under the burden of scrutiny that is always placed on women deemed slightly foreign, admired for their glamour, distrusted for their difference. Once she began resisting convention, even in small ways, the murmurs hardened. What might have been called youthfulness or spontaneity in another setting became, in the court's telling, evidence of unseriousness, disloyalty, or cultural contamination. She was no longer simply the beautiful queen. She was, to her critics, the not quite Iranian woman who did not seem to understand the gravity of her throne. Then came the kind of image from which conservative courts rarely recover. During a trip to the United States, Soraya was photographed water skiing in Miami in a bikini. Today, the image might read as youthful freedom, or perhaps just wealth behaving like wealth. But at the time, within the rigidly moralized atmosphere of the palace, it landed like provocation. The body of the queen, already politicized, already watched, had slipped outside the script. What some would have seen as modernity, the court interpreted as scandal. The photograph was not just embarrassing, it was dangerous, because it suggested a woman living beyond the symbolic constraints placed upon her. The image reportedly became so unwelcome that it had to be suppressed. And once a court decides a woman has become a problem, family politics become sharper, colder, and more inventive. Her relationship with her in-laws deteriorated accordingly. The Shah's first marriage had already shown how hostile that household could be to an outsider, especially a woman who commanded his affection. But with Soraya, the resentment appears to have taken on an especially vicious edge. Every sign of tenderness from the Shah toward his wife seems to have been read by his mother and sisters, not as marital intimacy, but as theft, a transfer of loyalty away from them. Royal households often talk about tradition, but what they frequently defend is access. Who is allowed emotional influence over the man at the center of the dynasty? Soraya, young and loved, disrupted that economy. For that, she was not forgiven. She was not innocent in all of this. Pain does not automatically make a person kind, and insecurity does not excuse cruelty. One of the more tragic distortions of the marriage involved the Shah's daughter from his earlier union, Princess Shahnaz. The girl was close enough in age to Soraya to expose the strange, almost cruel architecture of the marriage itself. The new queen was scarcely old enough to feel like a wife, much less a stepmother. Instead of growing into that role, Soraya appears to have recoiled from it. She resented the child's presence, bristled at the attention the Shah gave her, and seems to have experienced Shahnaz less as family than as competition. That is a painful thing to say about a young woman already under enormous strain, but it is part of the record's emotional truth. The court was making impossible demands of Soraya. She, in turn, passed some of that damage downward. Soon after the marriage, Shahnaz was sent away to boarding school. Officially, such decisions are always wrapped in language about education, opportunity, proper upbringing. But in royal families, distance is often another form of verdict. Whatever practical justifications existed, the emotional meaning was hard to miss. Soraya wanted the girl gone. Not because she was monstrous, but because she was frightened. Frightened of displacement, of inadequacy, of losing her husband's attention inside a world where affection was already rationed and watched. That fear would only deepen as the marriage grew more fragile. So the early years of Soraya's queenship were defined by a contradiction the public could see, but not fully interpret. She looked magnificent. She and the Shah were visibly in love. The photographs suggested glamour, intimacy, modern royalty. But behind those images, the foundations were already cracking. Youth mistaken for readiness, passion curdling into emotional combat, a court circling a young queen it did not trust, and a girl who had been elevated into splendor without being given the inner life, freedom, or stability required to survive it. That is how dynastic tragedy often begins, not with one grand catastrophe, but with the slow, private collision between human fragility and a system that treats fragility as failure. For all the glamour attached to queenship, the role can sometimes be reduced to a single brutal expectation. In Soraya's case, the court, the dynasty, and eventually the marriage itself began to narrow around one question. Could she produce a son? Everything else, her beauty, her youth, the Shah's devotion, the image of modern royalty they projected to the world, started to matter less with each passing month. A queen could be admired, photographed, dressed in Dior, praised in foreign capitals. But in a hereditary monarchy, admiration is only secure so long as it serves continuity. And after 3 years of marriage, Soraya still had not given the throne what it believed it was owed. That absence began to change the atmosphere around her. At first, it may have been treated as a private disappointment, the kind of issue royal households bury beneath discretion and polished routines. But time has a way of making private sorrow public, especially in courts built on succession. With every month that passed, the silence around her body grew louder. No announcement, no heir, no reassuring sign that the dynasty would continue through her. What had once been a romance now found itself judged by a biological deadline. And the tragedy was not merely that Soraya was under pressure, it was that her worth was being steadily translated into reproductive terms, until the woman disappeared and only the function remained. The Shah, by then, could not ignore the problem, however tender he may still have been toward her. Dynastic anxiety has a way of entering even the most intimate spaces. It follows people into their bedrooms, their silences, their doctor's offices. Eventually, Soraya was sent to the United States for medical consultation, carrying with her not only fear, but the peculiar humiliation reserved for royal women, the knowledge that her private body had become a matter of state. There is something especially cold about that journey, an ocean crossed not for pleasure, not for diplomacy, not for freedom, but for diagnosis. One imagines the outward luxury of it all. First-class cabins, attendants, elegant luggage, the protocols surrounding a queen abroad. But beneath that polished surface was a young woman traveling toward judgment. The setting was modern, clinical, authoritative. White rooms, male expertise, quiet voices speaking in the language of certainty. In that space, the enchantments of monarchy meant nothing. There were no jewels there capable of altering what would be said. At first, there seemed to be reason for hope. The initial assessment suggested that stress, exhaustion, and strain might be interfering with conception, but not that anything irreversible had been discovered. For a moment, the diagnosis offered relief, not joy exactly, but reprieve. The problem, perhaps, was not destiny. Perhaps it was circumstance. Perhaps the past few years, the pressure, the palace, the scrutiny, the emotional violence of royal life, had simply made pregnancy more difficult. It is one of the quieter ironies of Soraya's story that the institution most desperate for an heir may itself have helped create the conditions that made hope harder to reach. Still, relief did not last. When dynasties are frightened, they do not trust comforting answers. They seek confirmation, then confirmation again, as though repetition might force reality into obedience. So another opinion was sought, this time in Boston. If the first examination had left space for optimism, the second would close it. There, the verdict was harsher. Soraya was told what no royal wife in her position could hear without understanding that the ground beneath her marriage was beginning to break. She would not bear the heir the dynasty required. However the doctors phrased it, however delicately the news was delivered, its meaning was catastrophic. A marriage that had once been justified in the language of love was now placed under the shadow of dynastic failure. They returned to Iran carrying not merely medical information, but a sentence. And once that sentence entered the palace, it did what such truths always do in courts. It spread, it hardened, and it became weaponized. This was the period in which Soraya's life seems to have narrowed into ordeal. There is a particular cruelty in the way powerful families respond to female suffering when that suffering interferes with inheritance. Compassion becomes secondary. Privacy disappears. The woman at the center of the crisis is no longer treated as someone in pain, but as a problem to be solved, monitored, whispered about, and, if necessary, replaced. Soraya underwent one procedure after another, chasing remedies, submitting herself to examinations, treatments, promises, disappointments. Hope became labor. Shame became routine. The body that had once been dressed and displayed as royal perfection was now being studied for deficiency. And yet the worst of it may not have been medical. It may have been social. Instead of protection, Soraya met hostility. Instead of being shielded in her grief, she was exposed to the appetite of the court. The Queen Mother and the Shah's sisters did not rally around her. They watched, judged, and by many accounts, helped create an atmosphere of sustained humiliation. Gossip circulated. Her body became a topic. Her future became a spectacle. The palace, That great machine for staging grandeur revealed another of its functions. It could make a woman's intimate sorrow into collective entertainment. Servants, courtiers, relatives, everyone could be drawn into the theater of suspicion. Was she eating differently? Did her waistline look altered? Had anything changed? Even the smallest fluctuation could invite scrutiny, because in a place like that, female bodies are never simply bodies. They are read like political documents. And then there was the blunt cruelty of the question itself. When would she give the Shah a son? Not a child, a son. Not joy, not health, not love. A son. The reduction is chilling because it exposes the logic beneath the etiquette. Soraya was not failing at womanhood in any universal sense. She was being told she was failing at dynastic usefulness. That distinction matters. It is what makes the story morally charged. Her suffering was not accidental. It was structured by a system that treated motherhood not as intimacy, but as state production. In that desperation, Soraya appears to have reached for one of the few imaginable escape routes left to her. The Shah already had a daughter, Princess Shahnaz, and however strained the relationship between Soraya and the girl had been, necessity alters emotional geometry. Shahnaz had married into a politically prominent family, and perhaps Soraya began to imagine a solution that would spare her from total ruin. If the next generation could produce a male descendant acceptable to the throne, perhaps the pressure on her might ease. Perhaps succession could bend around her absence. Perhaps the entire palace would stop staring at her as though she were the site of some dynastic failure. But monarchy is rarely satisfied with improvisation. It prefers bloodline on its own terms, legitimacy according to its own hierarchy, continuity without compromise. The Shah rejected the idea. Whatever political or personal objections he had to his son-in-law, the result was the same. The path Soraya hoped might save her was blocked. A child born through that branch would not do. The dynasty, having already made impossible demands of her, would not permit an alternative arrangement that diluted its preferred line of succession. So she was left where so many royal women before her had been left, trapped between love and institution, between private grief and public expectation, between a husband who may still have cared for her and a monarchy that had begun to calculate beyond her. This is the hidden cruelty behind so much royal mythology. The jewels remain visible. The suffering goes underground. And in Soraya's case, the palace that had once elevated her now began, quietly and methodically, to turn her into evidence against herself. By this point, the marriage had entered its most humiliating phase, the stage at which love still existed, but power had already begun negotiating around it. The Shah, hemmed in by dynasty and inheritance, arrived at a solution that was perfectly rational by royal standards and almost unbearable by human ones. He proposed taking another wife. In dynastic terms, the idea was not radical. Royal households have always been skilled at turning female pain into administrative adjustment. When one woman cannot produce what the bloodline demands, another is introduced, and the arrangement is dressed up as tradition, necessity, or statecraft. In the Pahlavi world, there was precedent for such a move. The Shah's father had lived within a far more expansive model of male privilege, and the notion that a sovereign might solve a succession crisis by expanding the marriage rather than sacrificing the throne would not have seemed extraordinary to everyone around him. But what is customary inside a dynasty can still be devastating inside a bedroom. For Soraya, the proposal was not practical. It was annihilating. It asked her to remain in the marriage while surrendering the one thing that still made it emotionally hers: exclusivity, intimacy, and the illusion that love might outweigh politics. Whatever her volatility, whatever her flaws, her refusal was not irrational. It was the refusal of a woman being asked to survive her own replacement in installments. Accept another wife and remain queen in name while another woman does what you cannot. Smile through it. Endure it. Allow the court to turn your humiliation into policy. That is the kind of bargain royal women have been expected to make for centuries. Soraya would not. So she searched for another way out. Her alternative was desperate, but it was not foolish. It recognized a truth most monarchies try to hide. Succession is never purely sacred. It is legal, constructed, negotiable when enough men decide that it is. Soraya pressed her husband to alter the constitutional order so that the throne could pass elsewhere in the family line. If the problem was the absence of a direct heir through her, then perhaps the system itself could bend. One of the Shah's half-brothers could inherit. The dynasty could continue. The pressure on her could ease. It was, in its own way, an intelligent appeal, not to romance, but to structure. She was asking the state to do for her what it had always done for men: adapt. The Shah did not give her a clean answer. Instead, he retreated into that familiar refuge of powerful men who do not wish to appear cruel while behaving cruelly all the same. He implied that such a change would require consultation with grave authoritative figures, elders, advisors, guardians of constitutional propriety. It sounded official. It sounded plausible. It also appears to have been little more than evasion. The body he invoked had no real existence. There was no solemn council waiting to deliberate Soraya's fate. There was only a husband who did not want to say no directly, and a court already moving toward a different outcome. That, too, is part of the violence of dynastic life. Decisions are often made long before they are admitted, and women are left negotiating with fictions, while the real verdict hardens elsewhere. Around this same time, the Queen Mother changed tactics. For years, Soraya had been tormented for what she could not give the monarchy. But once it became clear that no amount of pressure would alter the medical truth, the older woman's gaze shifted. She stopped treating the daughter-in-law as a problem to be corrected and began treating her as a mistake to be erased. The same woman who had once selected Soraya for the throne now reportedly urged her son to end the marriage altogether. There is something especially cold in that reversal. Royal families often speak the language of destiny when they choose a bride. When they discard her, they become suddenly practical. By then, Soraya was also fighting battles beyond the family itself. She had never been fully at ease with the Shah's inner circle, and no figure embodied that tension more sharply than Ernest Perron, the courtier and intimate companion whose place in the Shah's life had long attracted fascination, gossip, and resentment. Perron was not merely an advisor or a social ornament drifting through palace rooms. He occupied a privileged emotional position, close enough to the Shah to inspire whispers, close enough to court life to become, in Soraya's eyes, something worse than a rival, a witness. That mattered. In royal households, access is power. The person who hears the sovereign, unguarded, who knows the private humiliations of a marriage, who occupies the soft space between public majesty and private weakness, that person is never neutral. Soraya seems to have understood this instinctively. She regarded Perron with open hostility, reading in him the kind of polished manipulator courts so often reward: flattering, clever, insinuating, and perhaps too comfortable inside the vulnerable center of other people's lives. Then came the betrayal that made her hatred feel justified. At some point, Perron approached Soraya and began speaking to her about her marriage with a familiarity that crossed the boundary from offensive to unforgivable. What emerged was devastating. The Shah, it appeared, had shared intimate details of their private life with him. Not policy, not ceremonial matters, not the abstractions of court. Their marriage, their bedroom, the hidden wounds of the relationship had been exposed to another man, then returned to Soraya as advice. It was an act of disloyalty made worse by its texture, not public enough to create scandal, but private enough to destroy trust. For a queen already living under scrutiny, this was a particular kind of violation. Her body had been turned into a dynastic problem. Her grief had been made into palace gossip. And now the marriage itself, which should at least have retained some protected interior space, had been breached from within. No wonder she was furious. No wonder she demanded that Perron be removed. But by then the true injury had already occurred. The issue was not only the presence of one confidant at court, it was the revelation that the Shah had chosen emotional triangulation over marital loyalty. Once that knowledge enters a marriage, it rarely leaves gently. Then the end came, as endings in royal life so often do, under the formal language of inevitability. In March 1958, Iran announced that the royal marriage was over. Soraya would no longer be queen. The Shah addressed the nation in sorrow, openly emotional, visibly broken by what the institution required him to do, or what he chose to present as necessity. Public tears are complicated things in a monarchy. They may be sincere. They may also function as absolution, allowing the man at the center of power to appear wounded by a decision that still proceeds on his terms. The spectacle of his grief did not alter the fact that Soraya was the one being removed, and she was not even there. At the time of the announcement, she was in Europe, physically distant from the court that had just redefined her life without her presence. That detail gives the moment its full chill. A queen displaced not only from the throne, but from the scene of her own dismissal. Soraya later maintained that the public declaration stunned her. According to her account, the Shah had spoken to her only days earlier and pressed once more for permission to take a second wife. The message was stark: agree to this compromise, or the marriage would end. Soraya refused again. But refusal is not the same as understanding how little time remains when the machinery has already turned against you. She still believed, it seems, that there was room left for repair, that the marriage, though shattered, was not yet beyond saving. That love, which had survived humiliation, doctors, courtiers, mothers, and dynasty, might still buy them time. It did not. This should have been the final chapter. A beautiful, damaged queen cast out because she could not secure the line. A king left grieving the woman he loved but unwilling to defy the throne he embodied. That alone would have been tragic enough. But Soraya's story refused the neat cruelty of a simple ending. Divorce did not extinguish the attachment between them. It merely stripped it of legitimacy and sent it underground, where it would become even sadder, more private, more compromised, and ultimately more fatal in the realm of memory than it had ever been in the palace itself. Once Soraya ceased to be queen, the monarchy did what monarchies so often do when they want to erase a woman without entirely losing control of her. It compensated her lavishly. The titles were taken, the role was stripped away, the public fiction ended, but the material softness remained. An elegant residence in Paris, a substantial allowance, expensive gifts chosen with the fluency of a man who understood luxury better than emotional honesty. A chauffeured life, a rare gemstone, a car fit for a sovereign even if its recipient no longer was one. On paper, these looked like gestures of generosity, the civilized aftercare of a royal divorce. In reality, they carried a more complicated charge. Wealth, in such situations, is rarely just kindness. It can also be a tether. Paris became her refuge, but it was also a kind of gilded afterlife. Soraya had lost the throne, yet she had not fully escaped the orbit of the man who had placed her on it and removed her from it. The gifts he sent were not only reparations for damage already done, they were evidence that he had not emotionally released her, and perhaps did not intend to. Everyone around them seems to have understood what polite society was not supposed to say aloud. The Shah remained deeply attached to his former wife. Whatever official necessity had ended the marriage, feeling had not ended with it, and so the relationship, stripped of legitimacy, migrated into secrecy. There were reports of private meetings after the divorce, encounters conducted in the Shadowland where former intimacy survives without public permission. That detail matters because it reveals the peculiar cruelty of dynastic love. The institution had declared Soraya unfit for the future, yet the man at its center still seems to have wanted access to her tenderness, her memory, her presence. She had been dismissed as queen, but not entirely relinquished as beloved. The contradiction is painful. Royal power had already decided she could not remain at the heart of the dynasty. Personal desire, however, had not learned the same discipline. But dynasties do not pause for heartbreak. They replace. Within a year, Soraya was forced to watch the future arrive in the form of another woman. Farah Diba, young, elegant, politically useful, untouched by the stain of infertility, entered the court in a blaze of ceremony. The wedding was everything royal remarriage is designed to be: splendid, strategic, forward-looking. It did not merely celebrate a union. It announced succession restored, uncertainty corrected, history put back on its proper track. For Soraya, the emotional violence of that moment must have been almost surgical. She was not simply seeing the man she loved remarry. She was watching the monarchy solve her. And then came the final wound. The new queen conceived almost immediately. In dynastic terms, nothing could have been more efficient. In human terms, nothing could have been more devastating. The child Soraya had been unable to produce arrived through another woman's body with brutal speed, and when a son was born, the verdict on her marriage was rewritten in the plainest possible language. The problem, the court could now imply, had not been fate, stress, time, or circumstance. The problem had been her. That is what made the birth of the crown prince so much more than a happy royal event. It was a public confirmation of private exile. The dynasty had found what it wanted, and the woman it had once dressed in jewels could now be remembered, if at all, as the beautiful failure before the solution. This is the hidden barbarity beneath so much royal pageantry. History records the christening, the succession, the photographs of continuity restored. It does not linger nearly long enough on the woman somewhere else in Europe, watching her deepest inadequacy, already weaponized against her, become national relief. Soraya had no choice but to continue living. What else does a fallen queen do in the modern age, especially one whose beauty was legendary and whose face still carried the charge of myth? She turned, at least briefly, towards cinema. There is a certain logic to that transition. Film is another monarchy of surfaces: costumes, lighting, projection, the management of desire through image. For a woman already transformed into iconography by royalty, the move towards screen life was not as improbable as it may seem. She took a role in The Three Faces and chose to appear under her first name alone, as if trying to reclaim a more singular self from the wreckage of titles. Not queen, not consort, not discarded wife of a ruler, just Soraya. There is something poignant in that gesture, also defiant. To use only her first name was to trade dynasty for persona, inherited role for curated identity. But reinvention is rarely clean when it is born from grief. She was not entering film as an ambitious unknown. She was entering it as a woman trying to outrun a former life that had already fixed her in the public imagination. And then, as so often happened in Soraya's life, love reappeared not as rescue, but as complication. While working in that new world, she became involved with the Italian director Franco Indovina. By all accounts, the relationship was intense and deeply felt on her side. She would later describe him as one of the great loves of her life, which tells you something crucial about her emotional nature. Soraya did not seem built for strategic attachment. She loved in ways that were absolute, even when absolutes were dangerous. She had once loved a king and lost him to dynasty. Now she loved a man from cinema and found, once again, that desire arrived already entangled. Indovina was married. That detail darkens the affair in a way that fits the pattern of her life almost too neatly. Even outside the palace, even far from Tehran, Soraya's intimate life remained marked by incompletion, moral ambiguity, and the impossibility of uncomplicated belonging. She had escaped one official triangle only to enter another, this time without a throne, but with the same undertow of secrecy and emotional risk. Perhaps that was part of the attraction. Passion can feel like freedom when one has lived too long under ritual. It can also repeat the old wound under new lighting. Then tragedy struck again, and this time there was no state apparatus to absorb the blow into ceremonial language. In 1972, Indovina died in a plane crash. The death was sudden, violent, and irrevocable. The kind of news that does not merely break a relationship, but collapses an entire imagined future in a single instant. For Soraya, it was another devastating removal, another man loved and then lost, another life in which intimacy turned, without warning, into absence. By then, she had already endured public humiliation, divorce, displacement, and the long aftershock of watching history continue without her. Indovina's death seems to have shattered whatever remained of her hope for a simpler, more human happiness outside the architecture of royal tragedy. The aftermath was severe. Depression closed in. Her film career, never fully established to begin with, lost momentum. The glamour that had once seemed capable of opening new worlds now looked thinner, less persuasive. Paris, which had once functioned as exile draped in elegance, became something quieter and more sealed. Soraya retreated into the apartment that had long symbolized both compensation and captivity, withdrawing from the larger performance of public life. She remained surrounded by the textures of privilege, beautiful rooms, notable acquaintances, the residue of old status, but the atmosphere had changed. What had once looked like freedom now resembled solitude with excellent furniture. That is one of the saddest transformations in her story. The world had always seen Soraya framed by luxury, first as princess material, then as queen, then as the spectacularly beautiful exile in Paris. But luxury cannot metabolize grief. It can only upholster it. Beneath the silk, the stone, the polished surfaces, she was becoming a woman shaped by repetition, chosen, adored, displaced, compensated, desired, abandoned by history, struck once more by loss. The royal scandal had ended, technically. The human cost had not. By the time she withdrew from public ambition and settled into a more private existence, Soraya had already lived several lives, and each one seemed to arrive with the same hidden clause. Beauty would open the door, and fate would collect the price later. And then, after years of distance, history performed one last cruelty. In 1979, Soraya learned that Mohammad Reza Shah was dying. The news came not as palace gossip now, not as the tremor of some domestic quarrel inside a court, but as the final collapse of a man who had once seemed inseparable from power itself. The emperor of ceremonies, uniforms, titles, and state rituals had been reduced to what all great dynasties are reduced to in the end: a failing body, a narrowing future, and the knowledge that even privilege cannot negotiate with death forever. By then, more than 2 decades had passed since their marriage had been broken, for reasons the monarchy called necessary and history called tragic. Time had done what time always does. It had changed governments, reordered loyalties, aged faces, dimmed scandals, and turned yesterday's catastrophe into archived memory. But it had not done the one thing people always pretend it will do. It had not erased love. Soraya wrote to him. That decision tells you almost everything about the emotional architecture of her life. She had been humiliated, displaced, replaced, and left to build an existence in the long shadow of a broken crown. She had endured other losses, other disappointments, other forms of loneliness, and still, when she heard he was dying, she reached for him. Not for the Shah, as a political figure, not for the symbol, not for the exiled monarch stripped by history of his certainty. She wrote to the man she had once loved at the center of all that spectacle, and by all indications, had never truly stopped loving. What she confessed in that letter was not strategic, not prudent, not socially tidy. It was the kind of truth people often carry for years because speaking it aloud risks reopening everything. She told him that her feelings had survived the divorce, the silence, the second marriage, the intervening decades. She wanted to see him again before he died. One last meeting. One last encounter not mediated by courtiers, dynastic demands, physicians, or ministers. Just two people who had once lost each other to the machinery of inheritance, asking whether history might permit them a final human moment before the end. It is difficult not to feel the weight of that image. A woman in Paris writing to a dying man whose face had once been on the coins, whose household had once determined the course of her entire life, and whose memory remained embedded in her emotional bloodstream long after reason should have cauterized it. The letter was not youthful fantasy. It was the late, stripped-down honesty of a woman who had already lost too much to decorum. And when his reply came, it appears to have answered her with the same devastating clarity. He, too, had not forgotten. He, too, still loved her. He, too, wanted to see her again. This is the point at which lesser storytelling turns sentimental. But what makes the moment powerful is not romance alone. It is timing. Everything arrived too late. Love had survived, but only in the wreckage. The palace was gone. The marriage was gone. The political order that had once made their union matter had already begun to disintegrate around him. What remained was not a fairy tale rediscovered, but something sadder and more adult. Two people recognizing, near the edge of death, that the deepest fact of their lives had outlived the structure that destroyed it. And yet even here, even at the threshold of mortality, the old humiliations of power persisted. The problem was not whether he wanted to see her. The problem was that he was still a married man, still physically under the care and presence of Farah, the wife who had succeeded where Soraya had failed in the eyes of the dynasty. There is a hard, almost bitter irony in that arrangement. The woman who had given the monarchy its heir was now at his bedside during his final illness, while the woman he may have loved most deeply existed just outside the sanctioned frame of his life. Royal arrangements have a way of remaining structurally cruel right to the very end. So the solution he proposed was not noble. It was secretive, compromised, and somehow perfectly in character with the emotional disorder of dynastic life. He wanted to meet Soraya privately in Cairo, away from scrutiny, away from official knowledge, away from the wife who rarely left his side. It was not a grand public reconciliation. It was not an honest reckoning. It was a hidden farewell, shaped by the same mixture of desire, cowardice, urgency, and compartmentalization that had haunted so much of their history. Even death, it seemed, could not purify royal love into something simple. Still, one understands why Soraya would have agreed. What was the alternative? To let him die as an unfinished sentence? To refuse the only version of goodbye history was offering her, however compromised it may have been? When people have been denied closure once already, they become vulnerable to almost any arrangement that promises to soften the final cut. But that meeting never happened. Before the plan could become reality, he died. And with that, one of the cruelest patterns in Soraya's life completed itself again. Love deferred until it could no longer save anything. She had been separated from him once by dynasty. Now she was separated from him finally by death. In both cases, the ending arrived before she could say what needed to be said in person. By 1980, she had endured the loss of great love more than once, and in one terrible sense, she had lost the same man twice. First to monarchy, then to mortality. The aftermath seems to have hollowed her out. Soraya remained in Paris, moving through the elegant afterlife that had become her permanent setting. refined rooms, old money, titled acquaintances, the faded glow of European society. Outwardly, the life still looked enviable. She was still beautiful, still remembered, still able to inhabit circles where names and lineage retained their currency. But by then the glamour had become almost archaeological. It belonged to the surface of things. Underneath was a woman who had spent too much of her life being chosen, displaced, adored, wounded, and left behind by the very worlds that had once elevated her. She withdrew from the brighter center of public attention and became, instead, one of those tragic aristocratic figures history never quite knows how to file away. Too famous to disappear, too wounded to return fully as spectacle. Her life lingered in memory because it carried the shape of classical tragedy in modern dress. The beauty, the throne, the love story broken by succession, the replacement bride, the unanswered letter, the last meeting that never came. People compared it to romantic legend because legend is cleaner than truth. Truth is uglier. Truth says that institutions can destroy a life without ever appearing bloody. Truth says that a woman can be surrounded by luxury and still be denied the ordinary mercies of emotional justice. Then, in October 2001, her own story ended in another room of private silence. Soraya was found dead in her Paris apartment. The circumstances only deepened the aura of unresolved sorrow that had followed her for decades. Even in death, the details seemed to resist full clarity, as though her life had become inseparable from that particular kind of aristocratic loneliness in which the public sees beauty, but not the final hours behind the door. And so the image that survived was not merely that of a former queen, it was the face people kept returning to in photographs. The face that seemed to hold, even at rest, some evidence of what had been taken from her. She was remembered not because she had worn a crown, but because she had worn grief so visibly beneath it. Not theatrical grief, not self-conscious melodrama, something quieter, more costly. The look of a woman who had learned too early that splendor and suffering are often sold together, and that the most elegant lives can conceal the most private forms of ruin. That is why Soraya endures. Not as a fairy tale, not even really a scandal. She endures as a warning about what happens when love is forced to answer to dynasty, when female worth is measured against succession, and when public glory is built on intimate loss. The jewels remain in the archive. The gowns survive in photographs. The court is gone. But the sadness stayed on her face, and history, for once, did not entirely manage to hide it.